So this gets us into the next question that's in our report, which is how will water export alternatives affect the fishes? Again, to keep in mind, we in theory have co-equal goals now. I guess these are official, of the delta ecosystem and the water supply benefits being equal. But the difference here is between Delta Vision and our report is that Delta Vision talks about a sustainable environment, whatever that is, whereas the report that we've worked on says the measure of the health of the delta ecosystem is the viability of native fish populations, which I think is much easier to measure and gives you some real goals to shoot for. Likewise, for water supply, the Delta Vision people talk about a reliable water supply, and as you'll hear in the upcoming talks, we talk more about statewide economic costs. Again, I think something perhaps a little easier to measure, at least more specific. Again, to remind you of the 4 basic water export strategies that we talk about: the through the delta, which is the current strategy, the peripheral canal, dual conveyance, and the no exports. Again, simplifying the many alternatives there are that go essentially in between these extremes. Now, one of the ways we tried to figure out how these different strategies might affect the fish was to go to provide a bunch of biologists with a free lunch at an IEP EET workshop in February 2008. And the idea here was to get a survey of delta experts, delta fish experts or biology experts on how fish are likely to react to the different export regimes. We had 39 respondents, and this, by the way, is Appendix E in our report. 39 respondents, and they first rated the effects of 7 water management factors on 4 different species of fish. We tried to keep it simple. Obviously, we couldn't have them rate every species of fish and all the possible factors, so we really condensed it down so we get a group of biologists to rate a relatively small number of factors. And then we had them rate viability for these same 4 species on the 4 options. How well would they do under these various options? And we use this in some interesting ways. And basically, it was background for us. You'll hear more about this when Jay talks about Appendix J, but it was used to support the decision-making analysis. We didn't necessarily use the information directly, but more in an indirect fashion. Well, the first thing, when you look at the 7 water management options, I want to mention what they were. The EET people basically said the 2 things that harm fish the most in the system, no surprise, pumping in the South Delta and reduced delta inflows from the Sacramento River. Those, again, it's a basic change in the flow regime of the delta is clearly one of the major factors affecting the fish. Now, another way to look, and then you look at the water export strategies, what this graph here shows you these are 4 species: delta smelt, striped bass, longfin smelt, and Sacramento River Chinook salmon, juveniles in this case. These are the basic water export strategies: in delta, peripheral canal, dual intakes, and no exports. And what these numbers are here are the low and high end ranges of sample means where we ask them rate how well these fish would do if everything's done wrong. We really screw it up badly. Everything you can think of is done wrong, and leaving it up to them to figure out what's everything being done wrong is. Likewise, we said, and on the other extreme, rate how well these fish would do if we did everything right. We managed the system perfectly. And the take-home message to get out of this graph is there's a range, of course, of how well people thought the fish would do, but you'll notice that the chance of there being a sustainable population in the future was never up at 100%, no matter how well everybody thought we would do in the system. We were surprised at this, actually, how relatively pessimistic the biologists out there were. Remember, this was an anonymous survey, so we don't know, who responded to what, but they were speaking what they were thinking at the time, and they had a relatively short time to do the questionnaire too. So we sort of forced them to put down the first thing that came to their minds. So this suggests that for most of the biologists out there, for all these species, they were pretty pessimistic about the long-term future of these species. That didn't matter which alternative you chose. But of course, you will notice that no exports generally comes up higher than most other options. And then again, this will be, I won't say anything about this graph, but you'll see this, Jay, you'll be seeing this, you'll be seeing this again, right, in the decision. So this is what it contributed to trying to rate the various options. And really what the bottom line on all this, though, is that when you look at this rating of desirable versus undesirable fishes, all things being equal, you find that the no exports option is generally regarded as the most likely to protect the fish. Business as usual is most likely to keep dry fish to extinction or rather to extremely low levels, whereas the PC and the dual facility, which in reality are the same thing, pretty much are sort of an intermediate level of disturbance to these fish. We also asked the members of this in the EET workshop what ecosystem investments they would make to improve fish populations. And what you would note here that just to write this down verbally, is that the highest number of responses were improve the habitat and improve water operations, which then this gets us to the next question, which is what actions will improve the delta for desirable fishes. And a lot of these were written down by members of the workshop. There are also things that Bill and I have been talking about, along with many other people. There's a whole laundry list of things we need to do, which tells you that fixing the system is not going to be easy and will take a major investment in time. Well, obviously one of the things is to create a natural flow regime. As you just heard from Bill and others, to really talk about this idea, how can we make the system work better for the fish, and especially for the native fish, which evolved under a particular set of conditions. And this means you have to mimic but not duplicate historic flow regimes somehow, including the tidal cycles, but you do want net downstream flows. You want high annual variation, as well as high interannual variation, especially in salinity. And in fact, you can argue maybe we want to make it more extreme than it was historically in some of these areas, mainly to keep some of the exotics under control. But do things but manage the system to favor desirable species. Obviously, a trend we have to stop is this increasing numbers of non-native species in the system. There are always going to be a wild card as long as we allow lots of fish exotic invertebrates and fish to come into the system. There's always a chance a new ecosystem engineer will come in and change things, make it difficult. So, but we also have some interest. I think there's some interesting ideas about environmental control as well. This is one that Bill especially and I are fond of, which is, Bill, do you want to say something about this one? Okay.
Yeah,
well, this is experimental dredging for overbite clam. This is a species we're all sort of giving up hope on, so we can't do anything about it. But in fact, the recent studies have suggested that the numbers of clams are very low in it's in the spring, right, when they're lowest, or at the end of the winter, yeah. When all the diving ducks are out there, they're feeding on the clams. The numbers get very low in shallow water. Most of the clams are confined to the ship channel, deep water in the ship channel, deeper than the ducks can dive, apparently. That's an opportunity to go in there and dredge, deep in the ship channel at the same time. Anyway, just one of these wild ideas that maybe has some merit. The idea of maybe we can actually control the numbers of clams and try to bring back some productivity back into the system. Obviously, reducing toxicants is another major area of concern, including all the ag return water that comes in, sewage, urban storm drains, the legacy metals that are out there. These things we all are concerned about. They're always out there, and it's very hard to demonstrate their effects in so many ways. Improving San Joaquin River water quality is clearly something that's got to happen too. Again, nobody likes to talk about it because it's a difficult non-point source pollution, but salts, as Bill Fleener mentioned, is clearly a big issue here in that water. And trying to figure out how to make the reducing entrainment in these facilities. Again, it's very hard to demonstrate direct correlations between entrainment and fish populations, but it's clearly an issue that needs to be resolved somehow. There's lots of places to create tidal habitats. Again, for most of you, this is pretty familiar. Trying to make the Cache Slough region work better for fish as freshwater tidal habitats. Conversion of fresh Sasson marsh from a freshwater to a brackish tidal system. This is going to happen almost no matter what. It's just a matter of whether we want to control it and somehow and make it start planning for this right away and figure out how can we make Sasson marsh work better for fish. Right now, it's managed pretty much for mallards and freshwater ducks that like freshwater marsh. We also have the issues of increasing floodplains. We know from the studies that we've been doing at Davis that floodplains have lots of benefits for salmon and splittail and other fish. And having more floodplains around the delta is clearly a big issue. And especially the Yolo bypass has enormous potential to becoming a major area for annual flooding of small amounts of it to benefit splittail and salmon. If we could have some annual flooding of these parts of the bypass, you might be able to increase salmon productivity a large amount. And remember, at least half the bypass is officially in the delta. So this falls under the purview of fixing the delta even. And of course, manipulating islands. We're getting ready for this in our crew. We're trying to set materials aside and hoping that when an island fails, we'll have enough stuff together so we can get out there and do some studies, do some at least preliminary sampling of water quality and fish. In the ideal world, we'd be able to plan for it, and somebody would say, we're going to flood this island. But I gather the legal issues are huge, but we can dream that. But have an island we could play with.
Prospect.
What?
We can have dreams.
We'd actually plan in advance, which we could choose the island we want to play with. But whatever we do in the future, we have to include restoration actions. That's, I think, pretty clear. If that no other message is just going on our present course is not going to be good for the fish. We're going to lose a lot of these fish, the desirable fish, if we keep doing what we're doing. And ultimately, if you fix the delta for fish with a peripheral canal, whatever you decide to do, you're probably going to make it better for water supply too, at least more reliable. So if the good fish could choose, the good fish is, I'm saying that deliberately, they would choose a heterogeneous delta. And the last thing they would choose is a present system. The fish that we want, the delta smelts, the salmon, they don't want the delta the way it is today. That's not, in the long run, it's just not a great habitat for them. And a partially flooded delta with diverse habitats would be better as well. But just an abandoned delta with a lot of open water habitat may or may not be all that great for a lot of these species. There's a lot of big unanswered questions with that. So I just close with this slide, which is part of the report, which is my vision of an eco-friendly delta. And again, the thing to notice about this is a lot of open water habitat, but not the entire delta. This purple is wildlife-friendly agriculture, which you can interpret however you want to interpret it. The idea is not urbanized, and it's diverse in habitat. In this case, I don't have a peripheral canal in here, so we've got the western islands protected in order to, you can keep diverting water from the system for a while. But the Yolo bypass being fixed as a floodplain area, Cache Slough, Sasson Marsh as of restoration areas. So we have, to my way of thinking, we have to be thinking in these kind of terms, really large-scale terms, if we're going to plan for the future of the delta. Otherwise, everything's going to be done willy-nilly, and we're going to get regime shifts we don't really like. And have lots of fish out there that are problems rather than something desirable. So, Bill, any other comments you want to add?
Yeah, I guess in the tone of what Peter was just saying, that laundry list, so to speak, of restoration actions, in the context of what I was presenting about dynamical systems, what it really means is that when you restore a system like that, what you're really doing is trying to invest in building resilience for the system that you want to maintain. So the more alternatives you give for that system to reorganize itself and maintain itself in the state that you wish for it, it's analogous to building resilience. And there's groups of people, resilient societies even nowadays, that talk about it like almost in banking terms. Anyway, hopefully we'll get a new delta.
Questions?
I've got one quick one. You know, land use changes, especially as large as what you're picturing up there, are generally made by individuals based on their own economic well-being. How do you see this happening to make the changes that would be necessary to accomplish your, habitat delta? What is going to be the impetus to cause all these owners to want to either give up or sell their land?
Well, yeah, fortunately, we don't have to worry about that. We can just say it ought to be done. And it's clear this is a huge governance issue, and I think that I know that the Delta Visions people are trying to deal with it. You need a way to deal with those issues. To a certain extent, of course, the putting out the vision out there that half the delta is going to be underwater does put some pressure on the landowners to think differently about their land. Mm-hmm. And we've had some intimations that even this map is being used by some people to make land decisions even now. So, because the vision of what the delta is going to be like almost no matter what does drive, makes people think about it. But yeah, that's you're asking an impossible question for this group. At least, but Jay is more likely to have an answer.
Or Ellen.
Than I am, or Ellen. Yeah.
I guess I just make the observation that on some of those colors up there, certainly the deep water habitat, that's going to happen by landowners decided they just can't keep up with it. The island's going to fail, and it's too expensive for them to keep up with it. It'll be like Frank's Tract.
So you're willing to wait for 50 or 100 years for this to occur?
It could be accelerated, I presume. It could happen tonight if there's a big enough earthquake. But some of that land use is going to change by itself that way. I think Sasson Marsh, in some cases, is likely to be that way. Hopefully we can turn it over before the sea level gets too far ahead of it. You want to be able to I think in the case of Sasson Marsh, you want to make sure that reverts back to brackish marsh, tidal brackish marsh, before the sea level gets too far ahead of it, and then the sedimentation processes can't keep up with it. And I think there might be an interesting question to look at of, given that the system is now going to become more sediment starved than it has been in the last 100 years, will it be able to keep up with sea level rise anyway, even under good conditions? I don't know. Or maybe the Thule Marsh kind of formation will contribute enough to that. I guess I've heard some talk about they're making a bypass on the San Joaquin River, which is sort of another feature that's already there. So, given this, we've only been doing this stuff for a couple of years. I think we're pretty far along. Got probably 20% of that map.
But I think in the final bit, it's going to be far easier to predict and manipulate where and what people do and motivate them than it is to anticipate or forecast what the fish are going to do.
Yeah, Cliff.
I have a question regards to, you called out the San Joaquin River as a problem water quality source. I'm interested in your opinion. Do we have problems with the Sacramento River?
Yeah, well, clearly we do, especially the Sacramento sewage treatment plant is with the nitrate issues and so forth, and pesticides. Actually, that's a better question for Bill. He's actually worked on the Sacramento River toxic issues.
Yeah, there's tremendous pesticide loading coming down the Sacramento River, all the orchards up there and the rice farms and things like that. We have regularly found evidence for fish that have been contaminated, exposed to toxic pesticides. It's still an open question. I think somewhat of a almost chasing for a holy grail to try and think that there are significant population level effects of those pesticides coming down, at least from my data and what I've been able to see. Seems to be the changeover in pyrethroids. We're starting to see that in some of our, which are endocrine disrupting pesticides, and we're tending to see, for instance, in delta smelt, an increasing incidence of things like intersex, disruption of hormonal balances. But far and away, it's the San Joaquin is way beyond that for sure. But certainly things like Sacramento sewage treatment plant. I mean, those kinds of things should just be handled. The releases of ammonium and nitrates and things like that. Those things are controllable. Pesticides is going to be a tougher deal. An hour.
Or we'll start the other
Yeah.
Well, I'll follow up with one. I view myself as an ecosystems ecologist, so I like to think about these things more as to how much carbon they produce rather than. And you showed the real substantive regime shift. Has there been changes in productivity of the fish populations out there during this 30-year period?
Yeah. Yeah, in the 30-year period they have, but it had to do more with fish not liking the Delta region, and then those are anchovies. And Wim Kimmerer wrote a paper putting things into context with biomass. Those fish numbers actually were in biomass estimates. But the biggest shift in biomass in the Bay Delta came when anchovies, after the clam came in, found that there was no more food anymore, and they left. But subsequently, I don't think there's enough certainty in the numbers to distinguish, but there certainly hasn't been the type of change that happened when anchovies left. Without question, the big mover and shaker as far as biomass goes in the system.
That is historically. Now, the last 10 years, after they've left, then you see this regime shift.
Yeah.
Is it similar in biomass with the regime shift to?
I think we're seeing just an incredibly dramatic increase in things like inland silversides. They're pretty much taking over, and many are beginning to think are becoming the new mysid shrimp as far as base of the food web for many of the upper trophic level fishes.
Are production estimates being made for these various species?
I think there's some underway by some of the pod groups, but I don't know of any direct numbers right now, Cliff. Yeah.
I just say something.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. That's a really difficult issue to get handled on because there's the shifts like in the zooplankton away from the edible species towards Limnothoina, which is this tiny species. There are enormous numbers of those Limnothoina out there that were not out there before, with the numbers of the other species being way down. And the fish, the fish numbers are really, if you just looking at the fact that we still have a lot of fish in the system, suggests that fish productivity is probably staying about the same when you start balancing everything off. But it shifted from open water fishes down more to benthic and plant-dwelling fishes. There's a talk about the lack of food for the pelagic fishes being the cause of for the decline of the pod species, but that doesn't necessarily mean a loss of productivity. It means that productivity may be going elsewhere, both into things like Limnothoina and maybe shifting more over into bacterial food webs where it wasn't before. Some really interesting questions actually about what's going on in terms of productivity. An alternate explanation, though, is a decline in productivity, but the evidence, from my way of thinking, isn't really there. Maybe you have a different opinion on that.
Well, I mean, the productivity issue, I think what it does is, people get mixed up with this, but to me, the productivity issue, basically what it would do is it lowers the absolute level of fish you can have, but it doesn't necessarily is the type of thing that drives population declines. And I think there should be a distinction about that. As you're saying, it's more of an ecosystem level question. But But I think when we start talking about pod declines and food abundance and copepod species relative to, is there less production out there of fish, I think they're two different questions, really.
There are two invasive species that seem to be very likely to move into this delta very, very soon. And I was just kind of curious of your opinions as to what it might do, if anything, to the fish populations, and that would be the New Zealand mud snail and the zebra mussel.
Yeah. I'm not sure about the mud snail.
Already here.
Split tail. Yeah. Split tail might like them. I think that might become a food source real fast. Sturgeon and split tail. The Quagga Mussel, it's been quite something. A bunch of us have looked for a very long time to try and find a sort of bottom-up effect on upper trophic levels from clam invasions, which we've had some substantial ones. And the evidence is still not clear at all. So I don't think it's going to be much different when we get a Quagga Mussel in here, which will, decimate phytoplankton and, make the water clearer and all this kind of stuff. But, traditionally the link, once you get into the zooplankton, the middle trophic levels, that link that trophic level is so diverse and runs at such different time and space scales that you lose the signal up to fish. So it's very hard to see a decline in fish populations being attributed to something like the invasion of a clam.
Actually, yeah, I agree, but there's another interesting aspect to that. If they just replace whatever is going on with the other clams, you can envision zebra mussel or Quagga mussels moving into Sasson Bay, for example, and just sitting on top of the overbite clams and just replacing them, literally. Sure. There could be much more of a problem for the water projects because of what they can do to ditches, canals, and facilities and so on. So it's more likely to be an economic rather than a biological issue. The mud snail is a very interesting one because, the evidence is not really out there, despite the fact they've become enormously abundant in some areas, that they've significantly changed the ecosystems they're in, except for some spring systems where they replace native snails, where they do take up a lot of the productivity. But in most streams where they're present, they become very abundant for a while. And there's some of these streams now, they've actually declined in abundance, as if they're sort of settling in. So I must admit, I'm much less worried about the mud snail, especially for the delta, than I am about other species coming in. Yeah, the Quagga mussel might be more of an issue than that.
Aside from the levees moving out of the way or failing, what can be done with the levee system to improve conditions for the desirable fish?
What can be done to the levee system? Poke holes in it.
Besides that.
Well, anything that would make the overall habitat more complex. Right now, dealing with complexity is riprap, right?
Not necessarily.
Well,
we have in those places where there's high energy wave action, we certainly use riprap. Mm-hmm. In those back slough areas, we use a variety of plant species that protect the slope against the minor erosive forces that we have. So is there something that can be done with respect to putting benches on the water side and planting them with some specific vegetation, or maybe making the slopes out of, Himalayan blackberry instead of the native grasses that are there?
There's potentially issues with, creating shade. That might be useful. But I think in general, most of the benefits of having, vegetation is basically just the engineering, the structural attributes of it. And, it provides cover, it provides habitat, and it provides, just a complexity of the environment. And if there's one general thing we should be trying to emphasize here, it's just the complexity of the environment. Back to essentially the way it was, branches hanging in the water, stuff like that.
Yeah. Most of the benches that we have out there in the delta that are existing, they're above the mean high tide. Right. Is there a benefit, or would there be a benefit to taking those down into a tidal range and allowing them to populate with tule or something of that nature?
I think so, yeah. It's just that, benefits, everybody wants to know what's it going to do for the fish, like what's going to happen to the fish 50 years out from now. It's crazy questions, really. It's a kind of it's kind of a knee-jerk. Yeah, sure, you're creating habitat complexity. It's got to do good things for the fish, but I would hate to have to want to quantify the percent benefit.
Wow. How do you sell that to a legislature that wants to know what are the benefits?
I don't know. I'm really working on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get asked stuff like that all the time.
Yeah. One other question: where and what type of habitat development should be the first to occur in the delta?
Well, there's clearly low-hanging fruit. I think Peter was talking about yellow bypass. That looks easy to get to ramp up.
And Sasson Marsh is clearly an area where Sasson Marsh I regard also as low-hanging fruit, partly because it's, even though you got all those duck clubs out there, it's still, compared to the Delta, is a less controversial system. It's going to go almost for certain in the fairly near future. I think that at some point the duck club owners are going to stop fighting sea level rise, and it's because you go out there, as I mentioned, in a high tide, there's a regular spilling over levees already, and the agencies, DWR pays for even now fixing the
Roaring River levees. Yeah.
Partly because of effects on the delta, I gather, but the marsh is going to change, and I would love to think we could be in a position where we could sort of take charge of that and direct that change and create sections of the marsh that are good for various kinds of things. The marsh also, again, I'm going to do sort of a sales job on this, but in fact, there's some parts of the marsh up in Nurse Slough, for example, that we've been working on that seem to have very productive. They seem to have a lot of the attributes that we think the Delta and Sasson Bay once had, and no clams, very few clams anyway. Lots of big populations of zooplankton, lots of native fish, and we don't really understand why some of these areas are doing so well. But it's clearly something to do with the high fluctuations in salinity and temperature that occur in the areas. So the marsh just seems to have a lot of potential for creating a lot of good habitat for the organisms we care about. It just won't be as good for ducks, which could be a problem.
Thank you.
You mentioned that habitat is important to the more desirable species and the native species, and water operations probably has a big influence on that. There's a lot of folks that have suggested that we change our attitude about some of the introduced species like striped bass and largemouth bass. Do you have any sense for how much benefit there might be in trying to, change like bag limits or size limits or something like that? Is that going to have any influence or any other change you can make to the system?
Improving striped bass fishing, for example?
Well, in that, but are there other things that could shift away from those species and cut down on the amount of predation on the delta smelt and other native species?
Yeah. I'm not quite sure how to address that. Do I think changing the bag limit would influence striped bass or help them in the face of
delta smelt? I mean, that's what people are suggesting. That we kind of have schizophrenia about striped bass. We think they're desirable, but we also don't like. We also think that they're eating up delta smelt and salmon. And that
ecologically, they've been here for well over 100 years, so they kind of have their green card. Been here longer than most Californians. But not only that, they are a major fishery, and they're very traditional estuarine fishery, and as such, and for years it's been the most valuable, one of the most valuable fisheries, certainly the most valuable fishery in the estuary, and that makes it desirable, because the idea here, it's not just we're trying to serve our fish-heady kind of notions of what's a cool fish and what isn't. It's what society wants.
The interesting thing about striped bass is very little evidence they ever were major predators on delta smelt.
And there's good reasons for that too.
Yeah. I like to think it's because the delta smelt smells like cucumber, and striped bass are not vegetarians. But you don't agree with that, right?
No, I don't.
No. But there's clearly the striped bass is clearly a species that if we manage more, if we create more of an estuary, we'll have them. Mm-hmm. Say largemouth bass is is the alternative fishery out there right now. And if we change the system back into a different regime for its more estuarine, striped bass, the largemouth bass will pretty much go away on their own, assuming the Egeria does as well. And that would be a positive thing, because they're probably major predators on salmon and other things that are coming down through those sloughs at various times. So, Rick, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. It was back a couple.
Oh, look what you did.
I was waiting for when I was going to start coming off the floor there.
If you want to.
You're good. You're good. It works.
It works. Okay, it works. One of the drivers and objectives that we'd all like to see out of this is a better situation for native species of fish. Yet in theoretical terms of changing things, not just paradigms, but the surface of the earth, in these types of ways, we now have a bunch of new characters in the ecosystem. Any thoughts or inclinations about whether or not we're going to see other fish rise as candidates for listing that are native, that are kind of off the charismatic list for the moment when we engage in this type of thing? Are ESA issues going to roll along in some unpredicted fashion, or are we going to see some?
You mean beyond longfin smelt?
For the fish, all the native fishes, are we going to see other fishes rise as candidate species because of, there's now a different mix of critters in there that are introduced as well as what they had?
Well, as things like largemouth bass continue to expand with Egeria beds throughout the delta, I think you're going to begin to see problems with, I think some of the more vulnerable ones, and I think tule perch is a good candidate. Largely because, they're, how would you say, relatively structure-oriented. They're the right size to be prey for things like largemouth bass, and they have relatively low fecundity because they're live bears.
Actually, another fish that's on nobody's radar list except mine, I think, is the hitch, Sacramento hitch, which is a species native minnow, which is it's pretty scarce. They're just scattered populations all up and down the entire Central Valley. Some in reservoirs, so it's not in immediate danger of extinction, but that's a species that I could easily see, if some work was done on it, people would get quite worried about it, because the number of populations, I'm convinced, is relatively low. And they are populations in the Delta still, but they're very small. So I think there's probably several species like this that just aren't on anybody's radar yet that could become a problem in the future.
Well, how would you suggest addressing those in advance, then?
Well, I think that the way you address those issues is by managing the delta as an ecosystem. I think the flow regime issue, this natural flow regime issue, restoring that natural fluctuations and getting more of a natural flow regime in the system, restoring places like Cache Slough as freshwater tidal systems where you had lots of good deep channels and so forth, will be good for these fish as well. Actually, I think almost anything you do for delta smelt is probably going to be good for all these other native fishes, because and delta smelt, maybe delta smelt and salmon in combination, because they require fairly high quality water in over fairly large parts of the delta.
I mean, in general, the reason why we use life history characteristics to look at similarities among species is because those are the types of things that the fish have evolved to do well in. And so if we move away from doing things that striped bass were evolved to do well in, largemouth bass and sunfish, we will be doing things that are good for the native fishes as a group, as a whole. And that seems to be saltier, more variable, cooler water.
So in your picture, the map that you've got here, Will that help? You just said cooler water, and I was going to ask about temperature with climate change. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that seems to be somewhat inevitable, doesn't it? Things are going to get warmer, and some fishes aren't going to like that at all. Certainly Delta smelt. Yeah, I've been pondering that quite a bit. I think in the short term, places such as Sasson Marsh, if they're very microscopically managed according to tides, it would be possible to play with temperature because there is an overwashing of the banks. In the summertime, the flood tides come at night. And what we see is that the marine system climate intrudes as well. And that isn't because the banks overflow and those flood tides at night, they tend to cool several degrees. And that has sort of creates small pockets in Sasson Marsh which stay below, within the range that Delta smelt can tolerate and live in. So we've been toying about playing with the Sasson Marsh gates and creating sort of a refuge and sort of a latch-this effort to save them. Field of dreams kind of thing. But beyond that, right now there is tremendous selection pressure on Delta smelt because of just basic habitat conditions, temperature and salinity. You know, it's cooler, more saline, but they are evolved to, salinities below 19 parts per thousand usually, okay? In the past few years, we've seen a much higher proportion, if not 3/4 of the fish that have been caught in the summertime have been caught at salinities over 12. Now that's unusual, and it's a clear signal that showing us that it's much easier for this fish to adapt to higher salinity water than it is to higher temperature water. And that has to do with the makeup of the cells. Higher temperatures require you increasing the density of mitochondria in your cells because you run out of the ability to use oxygen at higher temperatures. So it's going to be trouble. But I think Delta smelt are evolving. And because, their generation time is on the order of 1 or 2 years, relatively speaking, they can adapt pretty quickly.
So I guess now's the time that I ask another one of these tangential questions. Given that we're talking about a pattern of restoration and maybe ecosystem management that we would be implementing over, some period of 30 years as we move from the current system of conveyance to some other system of conveyance, what role do you see for the development of a local or regional, or let me be so bold as to suggest statewide ecological literacy, if you will? And what I'm getting at is what role is educating the California populace in better grounded notions of ecology have to say about how we guide the future of the Delta?
Well,
you both are ecological educators, no?
Well, it's hugely important, otherwise we wouldn't get up in the morning. And I think it has a huge impact. I mean, I see it just in my own kids. They go to elementary school that's very environmentally friendly, and, my daughter is, little Smokey the Bear there. She's just, always trying to do the right thing, but at least appreciates and recognizes and knows some of the things that are out there, the components of the ecosystem, the water cycle, things like this. They begin to appreciate it more, and they begin to appreciate it more. They're more likely to adapt to make things much better for the environment rather than, just think water comes out of the tap.
But in contrast to that, though, I think that, that's an investment we need to make is in the schools, because right now ecology and the environment, while there's a certain amount of that going on in the schools just because the kids are demanding it in part, it's not mandated to most of the curricula. It's nothing that's regarded as all that important. When you take high school biology still, it's the kind of thing they leave to the last 2 weeks of the quarter, last 2 weeks of the year, and they're lucky if they get to it. This is an area actually we should be investing large amounts of resources into. But if anything, we're going in the opposite direction. All the nature programs, the field programs that schools used to have are pretty much gone. there's a general lack of these things, which is too bad. Dr. Mount, you have a comment.
I want to force you fish heads to make some more opinions because they're so useful. If
Take
I
your
understand,
mics on.
if I understand you correctly, you would list, and I do want a ranking. You would list the Yolo bypass as the top priority for restoration. Is it a nodding of heads, or that is to restore seasonal flooding on the Yolo bypass as the highest priority? What's your highest priority?
It just seems the most straightforward. My highest priority right now, I think, would be to encourage conditions that ensure that the habitat requirements of delta smelt are around during the summertime, whatever that is. And I gave an example for Sassoon Marsh.
Obviously, if anybody would know, you would know what that is. So then you would. I mean, again, I'm trying to pin you down.
Yeah, sure.
So you've got one thing you can do. What's the one first thing you would do? And of course, I realize in this case we're dealing with the listed species problem of delta smelt. And
what I would do, I would get rid of the pumps in Barker Slough.
Okay, well that's good. I'm curious to hear that because I was going to ask the restoration of Cache Slough. Does it work without getting rid of the pumps and?
It doesn't work without getting rid of the pumps.
So you have to get rid of those pumps. Okay, well this is
because the net flows are backwards.
This is what's
at the wrong time of year.
This is what's missing right now from our report and everybody else is to pin ourselves down and say this is priority number one. Number one. Well, that's great to hear. Okay, what's priority number two?
Well, the Yolo bypass is right up there, just because it's something you could do, but it's good for different species. It's good for split-tail and salmon.
And overall system productivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, now so then comes to the second question.
Yeah.
So when we do have the Peter Moyle peripheral canal put in,
No, the Mount Canal.
What would be the number one and number two restoration you would pair with that canal? Because this is the issue where everybody's struggling, is how you would pair those. What would either reduce the adverse effects or amplify the benefits?
Yeah, sure. I would close the delta cross channel too.
Oh, if you built a peripheral canal,
yeah.
Close the delta cross channel. Aren't you a little worried about a stinking cesspool in the South Delta? Isn't that what most people would worry about? That your water quality would go in the tank in the South Delta?
Well, I think right now the most critical issue facing the ecology of the Delta with regard to politics and the general discussions out there is losing this little fish I work on.
Yeah.
You know, and those are the things that'll be the stop guards that could be reversed if necessary if we did lose it. But they're kind of knee-jerk things to isolate that fish on the north side, which where 80% of them are anyway.
Okay, I see where you're going. So then number two, besides closing the cross channel, what would that be?
You walking me down the lane here?
It's time for us all to. It's all time for us to fish or cut bait, as they say.
Yeah. I would seriously look at engineering Sassoon Marsh in the summertime to make it more suitable habitat for smelt, because that's the time we're going to lose them. That's the time of year we're going to lose the species.
Actually, I would
it's
take
the most critical time.
I would take that even further, saying making Sassoon Marsh work as a fish-oriented system.
Yeah, and if you have all the way from the Yolo bypass through the Cache Slough complex, down the Sacramento River, over to the Sassoon Marsh and the bays, you basically have the functional range of delta smelt. And it's surprising that we have an endemic species of fish that's anadromous in this system, and that's the size of its range. It's a ribbon. And so the things that we can do to promote, the types of life history characteristics we're showing up here, we'll do the best we can do to keep that species around.
Okay, so I think I'm actually getting this. All right, so then, as Dave pointed out earlier, the 10 years of lawsuits and the 15 years of construction, so in a perfect world, 25 years to an isolated facility, if that's the way we go. What do you do? So basically now what you're telling me is you've got to put your money into Sassoon no matter what, regardless for both those options.
Yeah.
No matter what investments you make in Sassoon are not sunk costs. they're all investments which would anticipate 25 years down the line.
Actually.
Yeah, you want some the underwater costs. Okay. And then remove the Barker Slough pumps.
And removing the Barker Slough pumps works in very well, I think, because the total organic carbon up there is terrible. It gives them all kinds of troubles with their treatment plants. They've been looking at moving that intake for a while.
And where will they move it to?
They want to move it over to the Sacramento River.
I mean, that's what I said at this microphone a year ago at Purple Canal
well,
Talk. Yeah.
Nobody believed you then. Now we believe you.
You never believe me, Jeff.
and then what kind of restoration would you do in Cache Slough that is different?
Well, getting the flows working the right way is a good thing.
So
You could play around with inputs, agricultural runoff type questions. I think I would be very concerned about maintaining these sort of shifting sand dune beaches at the lower end of the ship canal, which is probably the closest we've ever come to finding where delta smelt might spawn. And those types of things, I think, would do quite well. But other than that, I wouldn't do much because we'd probably mess it up.
Well, except
I'm sure Peter feels differently.
in the Cache Slough region, there's obviously a lot of connections. We take down some levees and reconnect a lot of the natural drainage systems. The problem with Cache Slough, of course, it's shallow water, weedy habitat, which is great for inland silversides and a few other undesirable species. And it also be good for salmon, and in the deeper parts, probably good for delta smelt. So it's a really very tricky issue to try to figure out how you'd make Cache Slough region work well for the fish, but I think we could do it. And it's really curious to think about managing the ship channel for delta smelt. Again, an issue that should be coming up because they're talking about, Stockton is taking over the Sacramento ship channel business, I gather. I think there's I've heard rumors that they want to start increasing shipping up the Sacramento ship channel again.
I think it was Oakland.
Oakland? Oh, Oakland was going to.
Stockton? Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a good time if he's talking about that. Is the ship channel? Do we need the ship channel for delta smelt? We may.
Well, and then you have to ask yourself, are those ships going up there? Is that an impact or not?
Yeah.
And we
Well,
walk down one
it
of
wouldn't be
those
the
again.
ships; it'd be the dredging and whatever else they did.
Right, if they had to. Yeah. Yeah, Cliff.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this exchange that Professor Mount started trying to nail you folks down. So I'm going to try to continue this a little bit further. Given the opportunity to actually work with the flows of the Sacramento River to facilitate some of the things you're talking about in Yolo Bypass or in Cache Slough and some of the other parts of the Delta, do you think it's more important for these desirable fish species? Is it the timing of the flow or the amount of the flow or the duration of the flow, going back to the Richter type of analyses? What attributes of the hydrologic regime do you think are most critical to get the desirable fish species doing well again?
Well, timing is really obviously a big one. It's probably the biggest one. And you'd certainly want your just the natural flow regime. You would want in springtime to have those flows elevated. How long, to the degree to which that would promote spawning for smelt, that would be good. But that means temperature more than anything else, and the flows definitely don't help with that very well. Other than that, I think it's just trying to do the flow regime that would keep the fish on the north side.
If I could add something to that, which is the Yellow Bypass again, which is building a gate on the bypass so that you could actually flood parts of it continuously every year when you have, at least when you have the water, by diverting more of the Sacramento River water through that from roughly early March, late February through mid-April, with bigger floods during bigger, wetter years. Because that's when it's important for salmon rearing, important for split-tail spawning, and probably important, might be a good time for delta smelt as well, to be able to increase flows down the bypass at that time.
But it's important to note, smelt are one of the very few fish whose abundance really has never correlated well with flow.
I've heard people argue in other western rivers that are highly appropriated, like the delta water supply is, that you could actually do more benefit for the fish populations by mimicking the historical hydrologic regime only at lower flow, lowered by 25 or 30% of the flow throughout the whole hydrograph, than you could by the kind of thing we're doing now, which is to increase flows during the low flow period and decrease flows during the high flow period.
Yeah, maintain the variability. Yeah, I agree.
But we have to recognize that in this system, in this particular system, we may want to make it more extreme than it was historically, even because we've screwed it up so badly, especially with all the exotic species. Having the delta having higher salinities in the summer, in big chunks of it they were historically, and still maintaining as a freshwater system in the winter, for example. Well, that's increasing the annual variability.
Yeah, or, increasing the annual variability, Peter say, but you could also do it by subregions of the delta too. Yeah. And once we have some of these so-called desirable fishes up to abundance levels that we're not as concerned about them, we should just hammer them, make the conditions awful for very salty or whatever we want to do in that regard, because it will make life really hard for the exotic fishes. They're evolved for, the Mississippi system, fresh water.
Actually, I'd like to. The other important thing Jeff brought up was the stinking cesspool of the South Delta, which you notice that we've said it's ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. Yeah. Obviously, those a lot of those issues there are pollution issues that have to be dealt with by the cities, by the farms, and obviously, I'm doing a lot of work on the by the San Joaquin River, and there's not a lot of water out there to even with these restored flows to push all that stuff out. Yeah. So you have to deal with the inputs, unfortunately, there. Yeah. And I don't know. And that's a huge political issue.
It depends how we use the San Joaquin River after we make a peripheral canal, right? Do we let all the water go down, or most of it? That would be sufficient flow to make the south side less stinky. But, I'm the wrong guy to ask about those things.
Other questions or comments? Okay.
On the south side, and maybe this is a question for Bill more than you guys, but if we have sort of New Soon Bay in there,
that's Moyle Bay.
I imagine that would allow more tidal action to occur further up the San Joaquin River. And so you would have, in the South Delta, more tidal flushing, more tidal action in those Old River, Middle River channels, if you don't have a peripheral canal through there. Would that improve the water quality down in that area? Potentially.
I gotta believe the tide's going to nothing.
I'm not convinced it would. I mean, we have tidal action now, practically as far as Bernalis. There's just such little flow coming through that river. I mean, you reverse the flow, with
clearly an issue. They took all the water.
Flood tide. So I don't know that there's much of a solution other than, more water coming out of it.
All right. Well, let me follow on that.
Another great, interesting study, though.
No. I only follow on that question. If you look at the Moyle map over here, if for example this bypass on the lower San Joaquin was large and included a lot of tidal marsh, what happens to the water quality questions there if you're passing the San Joaquin through a very large treatment marsh?
Yeah, well, that would be the trick, and it would also help greatly to cool it, which is another problem. The San Joaquin River has such low flow to it and high residence time that it comes in very warm, and so it would help cool it too by the methods Bill was talking about earlier, by spreading it out at night and where it can get some evaporative cooling and coming back in. So it would help in two regards doing that.
It's a very unpopular as you can imagine, diagram. But the interesting thing, the genius of Peter's map is those are the mostly mineral soils there, and they're not subsided very much.
Yeah, they are mostly.
Yeah.
This would be your treatment marsh right here.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We can all dream. Other comments, Jay? Do you have anything else? Okay.
Well, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start at 4 until 4 with the last talk.
It's a form of